Good morning, beautiful. Today we're tackling the dreaded exposure triangle, and I've got a secret for you. You've been looking at it wrong. Larry here with Southern Exposure. Are you an amateur photographer who wants to take better pictures and have fun doing it? Then like, share, subscribe, do all that stuff we ask you to do, blah, blah, blah. Most of us have seen the exposure triangle. It's a visual representation of the three main components of a proper exposure, and like most analogies, if pushed to the extreme, it will break, so let's not take ourselves too seriously here. You usually see the exposure triangle labeled like this, with the three sides of the triangle marked as shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. Then some versions go even farther by putting a scale for each along the side like this. Now just add in some extra information about the effect each of these has on an image, like motion blur, depth of field, noise, etc. And all of a sudden we've taken a simple three-sided geometric shape and turned it into something that looks like it would be more at home in a textbook on quantum physics than in a simple photography lesson. As a beginner, you look at the triangle, then look at your camera and say, okay, I'm at 1/250th of a second, f8, ISO 400, where is that in the triangle? The answer is, it's not. Because the triangle isn't meant to represent specific camera settings. It's just supposed to be a visual representation of a concept, and it can't be used like a slide rule or even a table of values. So let's get rid of all this other junk and just start with a simple triangle. By definition, a triangle is a shape that has three angles that all add up to 180 degrees. Always. A basic equilateral triangle has three angles, each equaling 60 degrees. Add them all up, 180 degrees. Easy, right? What happens if we change one of the angles? One or both of the other two angles has to change to compensate, making sure that the sum of all three always equals 180 degrees. Now, if you think of the 180 degrees as your desired brightness or exposure of a particular image, you can bring the camera settings back to the diagram, only now attach them to the corners of the triangle instead of the sides. And this shows us that any change to one of the settings requires a corresponding change in one or both of the other two settings to maintain the 180 degrees or the proper exposure for the image. That's it. If you understand that the three camera settings are interrelated like this, then you understand the exposure triangle. Congratulations. You see, it's not a magic calculator that will tell you what settings to use in a given situation. It's simply a tool to help you understand that your camera settings are related to one another and that you can manipulate the overall brightness or exposure of a particular image by changing these in relation to one another. And any change to one of those things requires a corresponding change to one or both of the other two. If you raise your shutter speed, you have to open up your aperture, raise your ISO, or a little bit of both. This is where it becomes important to understand what we mean when we talk about stops of light. And I'm not talking about the f-stop numbers of your lens aperture, but a stop of light is basically just a relative measurement whereby to make something one stop brighter requires twice the amount of light. Likewise, to make something one stop darker, cut the light in half. This makes for easy math when we're dealing with shutter speed and ISO, so let's start with those two. Let's say that you've got a good exposure on a scene at 1/125th of a second, f8, ISO 200. But there's action in the scene, and when you shoot at 1/125th, you're getting too much motion blur. So you have to raise your shutter speed, say to 1/250th of a second, to freeze the action. You've now eliminated one stop of light and made your picture too dark. Because the triangle tells us that we have to get that stop of light back from either aperture or our ISO, and we're ignoring aperture for the time being, we now know that we have to double our ISO from 200 to 400 to get the same exposure that we had before. You can watch your camera do this for you if you go into manual mode with auto ISO turned on. Every time you change your shutter speed, the ISO adjusts by a corresponding amount. Aperture is a little more difficult to calculate just because the numbering's weird, so we're going to leave that out for now. I'll get to that in another video. But all you have to understand is that the exposure triangle shows us that the camera settings are interrelated, and if you take from one, you have to give it back from one or both of the other two. So, Now that today's lesson in Euclidean geometry is over, go out, take pictures, and have fun doing it. Thanks.